EVO. The screaming stopped at 3:17 a.m. For 23 days, the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration at Earling, Iowa, had endured sounds that challenged their faith in ways their novitiate had never prepared them for. Inhuman voices speaking in languages that predated Christ. Blasphemy so vile they made seasoned nuns weep. The sound of a woman's body being torn apart from the inside by forces that had no business existing in a world supposedly governed by divine love. But now, in the pre-dawn darkness of December 23, 1928, silence had finally fallen over the convent. Father Theophilus Reisinger knelt beside the bed where Anna Ecklund lay unconscious, her face peaceful for the first time in over a century of torment. The exorcism was complete. The demons were gone. Or so they believed. But this story doesn't begin in an Iowa convent in 1928. It begins a century earlier in a small Austrian village where a father's sin would damn his daughter's soul, and where the poetry of suffering would be written in languages no human throat was meant to speak. Welcome back to The Devil Within. This is Prayers for the Damned, Episode 1, The Girl Who Wouldn't Stay Saved. If you're drawn to stories that explore the darkest corners of faith, where divine protection meets ancient evil, make sure you're subscribed to The Devil Within. Leave us a review and help others discover these investigations into the places where prayer and possession intersect, where the sacred and the profane wage war for human souls. Today, we follow the century-long torment of a woman who had become America's most documented case of demonic possession. A story that began with a father's betrayal and ended with questions that still haunt the Catholic Church today. This is Episode 1, Chapter 1, The Innocent of Sankt Georgian. Better by far you should forget and smile than that you should remember and be sad. Christina Rossetti wrote those words in 1862, but she might have been speaking directly to 14-year-old Emma Schmidt, who in the winter of 1823 still believed that forgetting was possible, that smiling was still within reach, that the terrible thing her father had begun doing to her in the darkness of their Austrian cottage was something that time might heal. Emma lived in St. Georgian, a village so small it barely warranted a name, nestled in the shadow of the Austrian Alps, where winter lasted longer than hope, and spring came grudgingly, if at all. The Schmidt family cottage sat at the village's edge, close enough to the forest that wolves could be heard singing their ancient songs on moonless nights. Jacob Schmidt was a woodcutter by trade, a devout Catholic by reputation, and, as his daughter was learning with growing horror, something far darker when the sun disappeared behind the mountains. The village knew Jacob as a man of few words but strong faith. He attended Mass every Sunday, crossing himself with particular devotion when Father Steiger spoke of sin and redemption. His wife, Bertha, was a thin, nervous woman who had grown increasingly silent over the years, her eyes carrying the weight of secrets that she dared not speak. They had 2 children, Emma, born in 1809, and her younger brother Wilhelm, whose innocence remained intact only because he slept too deeply to hear what happened in the cottage's back room. Emma had been her father's favorite until the changes in her body began. The curves that marked her transition from childhood to something more dangerous, more tempting to a man whose moral foundation had been cracking for years like ice over a deep pond. When the touching started, and then progressed to something worse, Emma did what good Catholic girls were taught to do. She prayed. Does the road wind uphill all the way? Yes, to the very end. Rossetti's words would prove prophetic for Emma Schmidt, whose road would indeed wind uphill for the rest of her natural life and far beyond. The first possession episode occurred on February 14th, 1823, Valentine's Day, though there was nothing loving about what transpired in the Schmidt cottage that evening. Jacob had been drinking schnapps since dawn, celebrating some private victory that only he understood. When he came to Emma's bed that night, his breath reeking of alcohol and something fouler, something that tasted of sulfur and decay, Emma finally found the strength to resist. "Please," she whispered, pressing herself against the cottage's rough wooden wall. "Please don't." But Jacob Schmidt was beyond hearing his daughter's pleas. He had made arrangements in the dark places of his heart, bargains with forces that demanded payment in innocence and pain. As he forced himself upon his own child, Emma's prayers turned from supplication to something else entirely. A calling out to any power that might hear, whether holy or profane. And her prayers were answered. At the moment of Emma's greatest agony, something else entered the cottage. The temperature dropped so suddenly that both father and daughter could see their breath. The oil lamp flickered and died, plunging them into darkness broken only by a strange, phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from Emma herself. When she spoke, it was no longer with her own voice. "Jacob Schmidt," the voice thundered, shaking the cottage's foundations, rattling the windows, sending the family's crucifix tumbling from its place above the fireplace. "You have opened a door that can never be closed. You have invited us in, and we accept." Jacob stumbled backward, his own voice reduced to terrified whimpers as his daughter rose from the bed, her body moving with impossible grace, her eyes burning with an inner fire that cast dancing shadows on the wall. "We know your heart, woodcutter. We know your desires. We know the arrangements you have made with the woman in the forest." The possession lasted only minutes, but it changed everything. When Emma collapsed back onto the bed, herself again, but forever altered, Jacob fled to his own room and barricaded the door. Bertha, who had witnessed the entire episode and from whom we get the story, fell to her knees and began reciting the rosary with desperate fervor. The next morning, Father Steiger was summoned to the Schmidt cottage. Now, Father Johann Steiger had been the parish priest in the village for nearly 20 years, long enough to have baptized Emma as an infant, to have heard confessions that would curl most men's hair, and to have administered last rites to parishioners whose deaths were far from peaceful. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he found in the Schmidt cottage that February morning. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her hands folded in prayer, looking for all the world like the devout Catholic girl that she'd always been. But there was something different in her eyes, a depth that hadn't been there before, as if she had looked into an abyss and found the abyss looking back. "Father," she said quietly, "I think I'm in trouble." What followed was a conversation that would haunt Father Steiger for the rest of his life. Emma described the previous night's events with a clarity and detail that suggested either complete honesty or complete lunacy. She spoke of voices in languages that she didn't recognize, of knowledge that had been planted in her mind like poisonous seeds, of a presence that had taken residence inside her and showed no signs of leaving. "I can feel it watching," she whispered, her young voice carrying a weight that no 14-year-old should bear. "Even when I pray, even when I'm in church, it's there. It's waiting." Father Steiger performed what he believed to be a minor exorcism that very day, sprinkling holy water, blessing Emma with oils from the Holy Land, reciting prayers that had been used to cast out demons since the time of Christ. And for a brief, shining moment, it seemed to work. The oppressive atmosphere in the cottage lifted. Emma smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in months. But as the poet Rossetti knew, and as Emma would learn, some sorrows are too deep for simple remedies. My heart is like a singing bird, whose nest is a watered shoot. My heart is like an apple tree, whose boughs are bent with thick-set fruit. Emma's heart might have been singing that day, but the fruit growing in the branches of her soul was already rotten, already tainted by what had been planted there in darkness. The respite lasted exactly 7 days. Chapter 2, The Sins of the Fathers. Come to me in the silence of the night. Come in the speaking silence of a dream. So the dreams began on February 21st, exactly 1 week after Father Steiger's blessing. But these weren't the innocent dreams of a 14-year-old girl. These were visitations, instructions, revelations delivered in voices that spoke with the authority of centuries. In her dreams, Emma walked through a forest that existed nowhere in the Austrian countryside, where the trees bore fruit that looked like human hearts, and the ground was carpeted with pages torn from prayer books. She was led through this nightmare landscape by a woman whose face changed constantly, sometimes young and beautiful, sometimes ancient and withered, sometimes not human at all. The woman called herself Mina, and she had much to teach Emma about her father's sins. Jacob Schmidt, she learned, had not simply been a man overcome by base desires. He had been a willing participant in something far more calculated, far more damaging to his daughter's soul. For months before that first assault, he had been meeting with Mina in the forest. Mina, who was known throughout the countryside as a woman who dealt in old magic, who could grant desires for the right price, who understood that some hungers could only be satisfied through the corruption of innocence. He came to me, Mina whispered in Emma's dreams, her breath smelling of grave dirt and burning herbs. He came to me because he wanted you in ways a father should not want his child. I told him the price, and he agreed to pay it. The price was not Jacob's soul. His soul was already too corrupted to be worth much in the spiritual marketplace. The price was Emma's innocence, her faith, her connection to the divine light that had protected her since birth. Through his assault on his daughter, Jacob had created a crack in her spiritual armor, a doorway that entities like Mina could exploit. But there was more. Mina revealed that Jacob had done more than simply agree to her terms. He had actively participated in rituals designed to make Emma more vulnerable, more susceptible to spiritual invasion. While his daughter slept, he had drawn symbols on her bedroom walls with oils blessed by unholy rites. He had burned herbs that opened pathways between worlds. He had recited invocations in languages that predated Christianity, calling on powers that had ruled the dark places of the earth long before Christ's light had begun to push back the shadows. Your father made you a gift to us, Mina explained, and we've accepted. When Emma woke from these dreams, she found physical evidence that confirmed their reality. Strange symbols had appeared on her bedroom walls, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when she wasn't looking directly at them. Her prayer book had been defaced with a writing in a language that hurt to read, words that seemed to burn themselves into her retinas. Most disturbing of all, she would wake to find herbs scattered around her bed, herbs that Father Steiger would later identify as plants used in witchcraft, in rituals designed to summon demons. As winter gave way to spring in the village, Emma's condition worsened dramatically. The possession episodes became more frequent, more violent, and more public. She'd be sitting in church during Sunday Mass when suddenly her voice would change, becoming deeper masculine, speaking words that made the congregation recoil in horror. "Your God is weak," the voice would boom through the small church. "Your Savior is a lie. We have claimed this child, and your prayers cannot touch her." Father Steiger tried repeatedly to help Emma, but each exorcism seemed only to anger whatever had taken residence inside her. Holy water made her scream as if she were being burned alive. Crucifixes caused her to convulse so violently that it took 3 grown men to hold her down. When the priest attempted to place a consecrated communion wafer on her tongue, Emma's mouth filled with blood, and she spat the sacred host onto the church floor with such force that it cracked the ancient stone. The village began to turn against the Schmidt family. Jacob, consumed with guilt and terror over what his desires had unleashed, began drinking even more heavily. Bertha retreated into silent madness, spending her days praying the rosary until her fingers bled from gripping the beads. Wilhelm, now aware that something was terribly wrong with his sister, but unable to understand what, began wetting his bed and crying in his sleep. But it was Emma who bore the worst of it. The girl who had once been beloved in the village, who had helped elderly parishioners with their shopping, who had sung in the church choir with a voice like silver bells, was now whispered about as if she were plague-touched. Children were forbidden to play with her. Shopkeepers would cross themselves when she entered their establishments. Even other children would run when they saw her coming. "I have a message from the morning wind to give the wandering dead." Rossetti's words proved prophetic as Emma found herself caught between worlds. No longer truly alive in the way her neighbors understood life, but not yet fully claimed by whatever forces were consuming her from within. The situation reached a crisis point on May 30th, 1823, the feast of Corpus Christi, when the entire village gathered for the traditional procession through the streets. Emma had begged to be allowed to participate, to carry flowers like the other girls her age, to be part of the community celebration of faith that had always brought her comfort. Father Steiger, against his better judgment, agreed to let her join the procession. Maybe, he thought, maybe the collective faith of the entire village, the presence of the consecrated host, all of this might finally break whatever hold had been placed on the child. Emma lasted exactly 12 minutes in the procession before the entity inside her erupted with a fury that terrified everyone present. She began speaking in what scholars would later identify as ancient Aramaic, Latin, and languages that predated recorded history. Her voice carried across the village with supernatural amplification, drowning out the hymns, the prayers, the desperate attempts of the priests to regain control. But most shocking of all was what she revealed during that public possession. Speaking in her father's voice, his exact voice, though he was standing 20 feet away, Emma began confessing Jacob's sins to the entire village. She detailed his visits to Mina, his participation in dark rituals, his assaults on his own daughter. She described things that only Jacob could have known, private shames that he had never shared with another soul. By the time the possession ended and Emma collapsed in the village square, Jacob Schmidt was ruined. The community that had once respected him now looked upon him with disgust and horror. Father Steiger, realizing that his small parish church was not equipped to handle this level of spiritual warfare, began writing letters to his bishop, pleading for help from experts trained in the most severe cases of demonic possession. But help wouldn't come in time to save Emma's childhood or her family's reputation. By autumn of 1823, the Schmidts had become pariahs in their own village, driven to the margins of a community that had once embraced them. "When I am dead, my dearest, sing no sad songs for me." Emma was learning that some deaths happen long before the body stops breathing, that some graves are dug not in earth, but in the human heart. Chapter 3. When Heaven Abandons Its Children. Silence more musical than any song. The silence in the village's church was indeed musical, but it was the music of fear, of prayers whispered so quietly that even God might not hear them. A community learning to worship in the shadow of something that challenged every assumption they held about divine protection. By the winter of 1823, Emma Schmidt's possessions had become so severe that Father Steiger could no longer handle them alone. The bishop had finally responded to his desperate letters, sending Father Matthias Weber, a specialist in spiritual warfare who had studied at the Vatican and performed exorcisms across the Austrian Empire. Father Weber was a thin, ascetic man whose pale blue eyes had seen things that had driven lesser priests to abandon their vocations entirely. He arrived in the village of St. Georgen carrying a leather satchel filled with implements of spiritual warfare. Crucifixes blessed by the Pope himself, vials of water from the Jordan River, oils consecrated at the tombs of martyred saints, and a journal filled with centuries of accumulated knowledge about demonic possession. His initial examination of Emma took place on December 21st, the winter solstice, a date chosen deliberately as Weber believed that demonic forces were often strongest during times when the natural world balanced on the edge between light and darkness. What he found in the Schmidt cottage defied his extensive experience with possession cases. Emma, now almost 15, looked decades older than her chronological age. Her hair had begun turning gray, not the distinguished silver of maturity, but the lifeless gray of ash, as if something inside her was burning away her youth from within. Her eyes, once bright brown, now carried flecks of red that seemed to glow in candlelight. Most disturbing of all, she had developed stigmata, wounds on her hands and feet that bled continuously, but never healed, never became infected, never followed any natural pattern of injury and recovery. But the physical changes were nothing compared to what happened when Father Weber began his preliminary examination. Too late for love, too late for joy, too late, too late. Rossetti's lament proved prophetic as Father Weber quickly realized that traditional exorcism rites were not only ineffective against whatever possessed Emma, they seemed to make it stronger. When Weber placed his hands on Emma's head to begin the ritual blessing, her body temperature spiked so dramatically that his palms were burned. When he attempted to recite the opening prayers, Emma's voice joined his, not in harmony, but in perfect, mocking counterpoint, reciting every word of the Latin rite, but twisting the meaning, turning prayers into blasphemies, benedictions into curses. Most shocking of all was the entity's knowledge. It knew details of Father Weber's life that no earthly intelligence could have discovered. It mocked his secret doubts about his own faith, his private struggles with celibacy, his buried grief over a sister who had died in childhood. It knew the names of other possessed individuals that Weber had treated. It knew the outcomes of exorcisms he had performed decades earlier, knew things that existed only in sealed Vatican documents that Weber himself had never even been permitted to read. "I know you, Matthias Weber," the entity speaking through Emma's voice thundered. "I was there when you failed to save the carpenter's son in Salzburg. I was there when the merchant's daughter in Vienna threw herself from the bell tower rather than endure another of your rituals. Shall I tell the village priest how many souls you have lost to my kind?" Now, Father Weber, his face pale as communion bread, pressed on with the exorcism anyway. For 7 hours, he battled whatever had claimed Emma Schmidt, using every prayer, every ritual, every weapon in the church's arsenal against demonic forces. Holy water, blessed oils, relics from saints, invocations in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Nothing worked. As dawn broke on December 22nd, Father Weber was forced to admit defeat. Whatever possessed Emma was beyond his ability to cast out, beyond perhaps the ability of any earthly power to dislodge. But the entity wasn't finished with him. As Weber packed his satchel with shaking hands, Emma's voice, her own voice, sweet and innocent, called out to him. "Father Weber," she said quietly, "it wants me to tell you something." The priest turned, hope flickering in his eyes that perhaps the child was fighting her own way back to the surface. "It says to tell you that your sister Anna didn't die of fever when you were a boy. It says to tell you that your father held a pillow over her face because she wouldn't stop crying. It says you've spent your whole life serving a God who couldn't even protect a 6-year-old child from her own parent." Well, Father Weber fled the village that morning without a word to anyone, his faith shattered as completely as if it had been made of glass and dropped off a building. The failure of church authorities to help Emma marked a turning point for the Schmidt family. If trained exorcists couldn't save their daughter, if the full power of Catholic ritual was powerless against whatever tormented her, then maybe earthly solutions were their only remaining option. In the spring of 1841, when Emma was 32 years old and had endured 18 years of intermittent possession, the Schmidt family made the decision that would carry her torment to American soil. They sold everything they owned and they purchased passage to the New World, hoping that an ocean's worth of distance just might break the hold that Austrian demons had on their daughter. Emma Schmidt became Anna Ecklund when she married a German immigrant farmer in Wisconsin, taking his name and trying desperately to build a normal life. And for a brief, blessed period of nearly 15 years, it seemed as if the change had worked. Anna attended church regularly, kept house for her husband, even got pregnant twice. Although tragically, both pregnancies ended in miscarriages that left her physically and spiritually devastated. But the demons that had claimed her in St. Georgian hadn't forgotten their prize. They had simply been waiting. "Remember me when I am gone away, gone far away into the silent land." Anna had tried to go far away. She tried to find the silent land where her tormentors could not follow. But as she would learn in 1908, when the possessions returned with a vengeance that made her childhood episodes seem gentle by comparison, there is no distance great enough to escape what lives inside the human soul. The Catholic Church in America was about to face something that would challenge its understanding of evil, faith, and the terrible price of some prayers being answered. Christina Rossetti understood something about suffering that most of her contemporaries preferred to ignore. That some wounds go deeper than flesh, that some violations echo across generations, and that some prayers open doors that we never intended to unlock. Emma Schmidt's torment began with a father's betrayal, but it evolved into something more complex. A test of faith that the church itself would ultimately fail. In seeking to save his daughter's soul, Jacob Schmidt had damned it. In trying to cast out demons, the priests had only given them greater purchase on their victim. In fleeing to America, the family had simply exported their curse to new ground. Anna Ecklund's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that sometimes our efforts to find salvation only deepen our damnation, that sometimes the very institutions meant to protect us become complicit in our own destruction. As Rossetti wrote, "Better by far you should forget and smile than that you should remember and be sad." But Anna Ecklund would never be given the mercy of forgetting. Her memory would become perfect, terrible, encompassing not just her own suffering, but the suffering of everyone she encountered. Priests who lost their faith, families who lost their peace, communities who lost their innocence. In 1928, 45 years after fleeing Austrian soil, 69-year-old Anna Ecklund would be brought to Earling, Iowa, for what the Catholic Church declared would be the definitive exorcism. 23 days of spiritual warfare that would either save her soul or damn everyone who attempted to help her. Father Theophilus Reisinger, the Church's most experienced exorcist, would face not just Anna's demons, but the accumulated evil of a century of suffering. What he discovered in that Iowa convent would force the Church to confront a terrifying possibility: that some possessions aren't meant to be cured. They're meant to be spread. Next time on Prayers for the Damned, the final exorcism, the price of victory, and the question that still haunts Earling, Iowa. When we cast out demons, where do they go?